My sister walked into the lake house I paid off, smirked, and stated, "Mom promised this to me once she retires. Hope you didn't get too comfortable." Dad laughed and stated, "It's better in her name anyway." I just turned to my attorney, handed him the keys, and stated, "List it first thing tomorrow." She screamed, "You can't sell my house." I smiled and declared, "Funny, but that's exactly what I'm doing." I, 32M, stood in the doorway of what I thought was my sanctuary, watching my younger sister stride through the lake house like she owned it. She had that familiar smirk plastered across her face as she ran her fingers along the granite countertops I had personally selected and paid for. She turned to me with that condescending look I remembered from childhood and announced that Mom had promised her the house once she retired. She hoped I hadn't gotten too comfortable. The words hit me like a slap, but what came next was worse. Dad, who had been silent in the corner nursing his beer, actually laughed. He nodded approvingly and said it would be better in her name anyway. I felt something snap inside me. This house represented 3 years of my life, countless overtime hours, and every penny of my savings. I had bought it as a family retreat, somewhere we could all gather and create memories. Instead, I was watching my family casually discuss redistributing my property like I wasn't even in the room. My attorney, who had been reviewing some documents at the kitchen table, looked up with raised eyebrows. Without a word, I walked over and placed the house keys directly in his palm. I told him to list the property first thing tomorrow morning. The silence that followed was deafening. My sister's face went from smug to confused to panicked in the span of seconds. She started screaming that I couldn't sell her house. The irony wasn't lost on me as I smiled and calmly explained that selling my house was exactly what I planned to do. Let me back up and explain how we got here. 2 years ago, my parents started dropping hints about wanting a family lake house. Mom would show me real estate listings during Sunday dinners, and Dad would reminisce about the lake houses his wealthy friends owned. They painted this picture of family gatherings, grandchildren learning to fish, and building lasting memories. The problem was their finances. Dad's construction business had been struggling since the recession, and Mom's part-time teaching barely covered their basic expenses. They had no savings for a down payment, let alone the ability to qualify for a mortgage on a second home. That's where I came in. I had been working as a software engineer for a major tech company, pulling down a 6-figure salary and living modestly in a small apartment. I had been saving aggressively, originally planning to buy my own home, but the family lake house idea appealed to me. I was single, focused on my career, and the thought of having a place where I could escape and reconnect with family seemed perfect. I spent months researching properties, visiting dozens of houses, and negotiating deals. I finally found the perfect place, a 3-bedroom cabin with a private dock, nestled on 2 acres of wooded shoreline. The price tag was hefty, nearly $400,000, but I could swing it. I put down 20% in cash and took out a mortgage for the remainder. The deed went into my name. The monthly payments came from my account, and I handled all the insurance, taxes, and maintenance. I made it clear to my parents that while this was intended as a family retreat, I was the legal owner and financial responsible party. For the first year, everything was perfect. We had monthly family gatherings, celebrated holidays there, and I genuinely felt like I had made a good investment in family relationships. My sister would bring her husband and kids, we would barbecue on the deck, and everyone seemed grateful for what I had provided. But I started noticing subtle changes in how my parents, particularly my mother, talked about the house. She began referring to it as our lake house in conversations with neighbors and friends. She would make plans for the property without consulting me, like scheduling her book club meetings there or promising her sister she could use it for a weekend getaway. When I gently reminded her that I was the owner and would appreciate being consulted before she made commitments, she brushed me off. She told me not to be so possessive about family property and reminded me that the house was supposed to be for everyone. My sister started showing up more frequently, sometimes without even letting me know. I would arrive for a peaceful weekend only to find her family already there, having made themselves completely at home. When I expressed frustration about the lack of communication, she accused me of being controlling and selfish. The breaking point came 3 months ago during a family barbecue. I overheard my mother on the phone with her financial advisor, discussing retirement planning. She mentioned that she wouldn't need to worry about housing expenses in retirement because she would have the lake house. When I asked her what she meant, She casually explained that she assumed I would sign the property over to her once she retired. I was stunned. I asked when we had discussed this arrangement, and she seemed genuinely confused by my question. In her mind, the house had always been a family investment that would naturally transfer to her as the family matriarch. The fact that I had paid for everything was apparently just a temporary technicality. I tried to have a rational conversation about expectations and ownership, but it quickly became clear that my parents had constructed an entirely different narrative about the situation. They saw me as a financial facilitator who had helped the family acquire property, not as the actual owner making a personal investment. My sister was even worse. She started talking openly about her plans for the house, including renovations she wanted to make and how she would redecorate once it was officially hers. She had apparently been operating under the same assumption as my parents, that I was just holding the property temporarily. I consulted with a real estate attorney to understand my legal standing. He confirmed what I already knew. The house was entirely mine, purchased with my money and held in my name. My family had no legal claim to the property regardless of their expectations or my original intentions. But legal ownership and family relationships are two different things. I found myself in an impossible situation where asserting my rights would be seen as betraying family loyalty, but allowing the current assumptions to continue would mean giving up hundreds of thousands of dollars in property. I decided to try one more family meeting to clarify the situation. I explained my financial investment, showed them the mortgage documents with my name, and tried to reset expectations about ownership. I made it clear that while I was happy to continue sharing the property, I needed them to acknowledge that it was my house and respect my role as the decision maker. The response was worse than I expected. My father accused me of being greedy and materialistic. He said that family should come before money and that I was disappointing him with my selfishness. My mother cried and said she felt betrayed, that she had been counting on the lake house for her retirement security. My sister was the most vicious. She accused me of manipulating the family by dangling the house as a carrot and then snatching it away. She said I was using my money to control everyone and that I had probably planned this bait and switch from the beginning. That conversation happened 6 weeks ago. Since then, the family dynamics had become increasingly toxic. My parents started excluding me from family gatherings while still expecting access to the lake house. My sister began showing up with friends, treating the place like her personal vacation rental. The final straw came when I discovered that my mother had been telling extended family members that the lake house was hers. Cousins started reaching out to ask about borrowing the house for their own vacations, and my aunt mentioned how generous it was of Mom to let the family use her property. I realized that my family had not only dismissed my ownership, but were actively working to establish a social narrative that supported their version of reality. They were systematically undermining my position while continuing to benefit from my financial investment. That's what led to today's confrontation. I had driven to the lake house for what I thought would be a quiet weekend alone. Instead, I found my sister already there with her family, acting like the lady of the manor. When I asked why she hadn't informed me of her plans, she said she didn't need permission to use family property. Then came the bombshell about Mom's retirement promise and Dad's agreement that the house would be better in her name. They had apparently been planning this transition without any intention of consulting me or compensating me for my investment. Standing there with the keys in my attorney's hand, watching my sister's face crumble as she realized I wasn't bluffing, I felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. This wasn't how I had envisioned things ending, but I couldn't see any other path forward. My attorney, who had become familiar with the family dynamics over the past few months, calmly explained to my parents that I had every right to sell the property. He had already prepared the necessary paperwork after our previous consultations, anticipating this moment might come. My father started blustering about family loyalty and how I was making a huge mistake. He said I would regret this decision and that money wasn't everything. I pointed out that he hadn't seemed concerned about money when I was the one paying all the bills. My mother tried a different approach, appealing to emotion and family history. She reminded me of all the good times we had shared at the house and asked how I could throw that away over a misunderstanding. I explained that the misunderstanding was entirely on their part and that I had been clear about ownership from the beginning. My sister alternated between fury and desperation. She demanded to know how much I wanted for the house, apparently assuming she could simply buy me out. When I told her the current market value, Nearly $500,000 after recent improvements in market appreciation, she went silent. She clearly hadn't considered the financial reality of her demands. But I wasn't interested in selling to family anyway. The relationship damage was too severe, and I knew that any ongoing financial entanglement would just create more opportunities for conflict. A clean break was the only solution. Update 1. The house went on the market within 48 hours. My attorney had recommended an aggressive pricing strategy given the prime location and current market conditions. We listed it at $520,000, expecting to negotiate down, but hoping to maximize the return on my investment. The family reaction was swift and predictable. My phone exploded with calls and texts from various relatives who had suddenly learned about the situation. Apparently, my parents had launched a full-scale campaign to paint me as the villain in this scenario. My aunt called to lecture me about family values and suggested that I was having some kind of mental breakdown. My uncle offered to mediate the dispute, clearly not understanding that there was nothing to mediate. Several cousins sent passive-aggressive texts about how disappointed they were in my behavior. Most painful was my grandmother, who called with tears in her voice to ask what had happened to the sweet grandson she thought she knew. My parents had apparently told her that I had promised them the house, and then cruelly changed my mind for no reason. I found myself in the surreal position of having to defend my right to control property I had purchased with my own money. The family narrative had become so twisted that basic facts about ownership were being treated as irrelevant details. My sister tried a different approach. She showed up at my apartment with what she called a reasonable compromise. She proposed that I transfer the house to my parents immediately, and they would add me to their will to inherit it back eventually. In her mind, this would satisfy everyone's needs and restore family harmony. I explained that her proposal would require me to give up hundreds of thousands of dollars in current value for the possibility of maybe inheriting the property decades in the future. She seemed genuinely confused about why I found this unacceptable. When I pointed out that wills can be changed and that my parents could easily decide to leave the property to her instead, she assured me that would never happen. Her confidence was either naive or manipulative, and I wasn't interested in finding out which. The real estate interest was immediate and intense. We had 3 showings within the first week and multiple offers above asking price within 10 days. The lake house market was apparently red hot, with wealthy professionals looking for pandemic-era retreats. I accepted an offer from a cash buyer at $535,000. The buyers were a retired couple from the city who planned to use it as their primary residence. They seemed like good people who would appreciate what I had built there. The 30-day closing timeline meant that my family's window for using the property was rapidly shrinking. My parents made one final desperate attempt to change my mind, offering to pay me back for my investment over time. When I asked for details about their repayment plan, it became clear they had no realistic way to generate that kind of money. My father's construction business was barely breaking even, and my mother's part-time income wouldn't cover a significant monthly payment. They were essentially asking me to provide them with a no-interest loan that might never be repaid, secured by their promise to eventually give me back my own property. I declined their offer, and the relationship reached a new level of toxicity. My mother sent me a long email detailing all the sacrifices she had made for me as a child and how disappointed she was that I couldn't do this one thing for her in return. She accused me of being cold and calculating, prioritizing money over family love. My sister's approach was more direct. She threatened to contest the sale, claiming that she had legal rights to the property based on my parents' promises. My attorney quickly dismissed this threat, explaining that verbal promises from non-owners carry no legal weight in property disputes. But the threats revealed something important about my family's mindset. They genuinely believed that their emotional investment in the house created some kind of legal entitlement. They couldn't distinguish between their desire for the property and their right to claim it. Update 2. The closing went smoothly despite my family's continued interference attempts. My sister actually showed up at the title company, demanding to speak with the buyers and explain that the sale was happening under duress. Security had to escort her from the building. When I handed over the keys to the new owners and received the check for my proceeds, I felt an unexpected sense of relief. The financial stress was gone, but more importantly, the psychological burden of managing my family's expectations had been lifted. I netted nearly $150,000 in profit after paying off the mortgage, and covering transaction costs. It was a substantial return on my investment, but it came at the cost of family relationships that I had valued more than money. The aftermath has been predictably difficult. My parents have essentially cut me off, declining to attend family gatherings where I might be present. They've made it clear that they consider my actions unforgivable and that rebuilding the relationship would require me to somehow undo what I've done. My sister has been more actively hostile. She's used social media to share cryptic posts about family betrayal and loyalty, clearly designed to generate sympathy and paint me as the villain. Several mutual friends have reached out to ask about the situation, apparently confused by the conflicting narratives they're hearing. But I've also received surprising support from unexpected sources. My uncle, after learning the full financial details of the situation, privately told me that I had made the right decision. He said my parents had unrealistic expectations and that I shouldn't have been expected to subsidize their retirement lifestyle. Several friends and colleagues have expressed admiration for my willingness to stand up for myself in a difficult family situation. They've pointed out that my family was essentially asking me to give up my financial security to satisfy their wants, not their needs. The most interesting response came from my grandmother. After getting the full story from me directly, she admitted that she had been given incomplete information by my parents. She said she understood why I felt I had no choice but to sell, and while she was sad about the family conflict, she didn't blame me for protecting my interests. I've used the proceeds from the sale to finally buy my own primary residence, a smaller but beautiful home in a neighborhood I love. For the first time in years, I'm living in a space that belongs entirely to me, without having to consider anyone else's expectations or demands. Update 3. 6 months have passed since the lake house sale, and the family dynamics have largely settled into a new normal. My parents and sister maintain their position that I betrayed the family, while I've accepted that some relationships may never recover. But there have been some unexpected developments. My brother, who had remained neutral during the initial conflict, recently reached out to apologize for not supporting me earlier. He admitted that he had been afraid of taking sides, but had come to realize that my family's expectations were unreasonable. He also shared some information that put the whole situation in a different context. Apparently, my parents have been struggling financially for longer than I realized, and the lake house represented their only plan for retirement security. They had been counting on my generosity to solve problems they hadn't shared with me. My sister's marriage has been having difficulties, partly due to financial stress, and she had been hoping that access to the lake house would provide some stability for her family. While this doesn't excuse her behavior, it helps me understand the desperation behind her actions. I've also learned that my family's version of events has not been as widely accepted as I initially thought. Several relatives who initially criticized my decision have since reached out privately to express different views. They've admitted that after thinking about it more carefully, they understand why I felt I had no choice. My parents have made one final attempt at reconciliation, but it came with conditions that I couldn't accept. They wanted me to acknowledge that I had handled the situation badly and apologize for the pain I had caused. In exchange, they would consider forgiving me and rebuilding our relationship. I explained that I was sorry about the family conflict, but couldn't apologize for protecting my own financial interests when they were trying to take my property without compensation. The conversation ended with the same impasse we've had all along. I've had to accept that some family relationships may be permanently damaged, but I've also learned valuable lessons about boundaries and self-advocacy. My family's inability to respect my ownership rights was ultimately a symptom of deeper problems with how they viewed my role in the family dynamic. Looking back, I realized that I had been cast in the role of the family provider without my explicit consent. My success had created expectations that I would use my resources to solve everyone else's problems, regardless of the personal cost to me. The lake house situation forced me to confront this dynamic and establish clear boundaries about what I would and wouldn't accept from family members. It was painful, but it was also necessary for my own long-term well-being. I still miss the idea of what our family gatherings could have been, but I don't regret protecting myself from a situation that had become unsustainable. Sometimes standing up for yourself means disappointing people you love, and that's a lesson I wish I had learned earlier in life. My new home has become a sanctuary where I can focus on building the life I want rather than managing other people's expectations. I've started dating again, pursued hobbies I had neglected, and generally feel more in control of my own destiny. The family drama taught me that love and respect are not the same thing, and that maintaining family relationships at any cost is not always the right choice. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is establish clear boundaries and stick to them, even when it causes temporary pain. I hope that someday my family will understand why I made the choices I did, but I've accepted that they may never get there. What matters most is that I can look at myself in the mirror and know that I stood up for what was right, even when it was difficult. The lake house is gone, but the lessons I learned from that experience will stay with me forever. And sometimes, that's the most valuable thing you can get from a painful situation.